It's not very often you get to meet somebody like the gentleman I'm going to introduce you to, but um, in the late '80s, I was working in the U.S. Senate, and one day the receptionist called me, and this was when the movie Good Morning Vietnam was extremely popular, and the receptionist called and said, "There's a gentleman here named Adrian Cronauer, and he wants to meet Senator Dole." And so, having been the guy that did all the veterans and defense issues for the leader, I invited Adrian back, and I really had a chance to get to know him. I did introduce him to the leader as well as many other Senate Republicans. But Adrian spent many, many decades in the broadcasting business, and I'll let him talk about that a little bit, about himself. And then most recently attended University of Pennsylvania's law school. And so he came to Washington to try to start a communications law practice, but I think I was one of the ones that helped divert him into very visible Republican politics. And he most recently was a special assistant in the Office of POWMIA Affairs in the Office of Secretary of Defense. And one of the reasons I think he was such a success in that is because this man is probably one of the 2 or 3 most recognizable Vietnam veterans in America. When you talk to people and you say, name me, 2 or 3 people that you know were in Vietnam or have an affiliation with Vietnam, one of them will typically be Adrian Cronauer. And so a lot of the veterans groups really, really identify with him because of the movie. So he did co-write that script that eventually became the movie. I think he'll tell you that Hollywood probably rewrote a little bit. But one of the most fascinating things is his log on every day coming on that Robin Williams did fairly well in the movie, not quite accurately, has become a cultural phenomena in America. Because you'll hear "Good Morning Memphis" or "Good Morning Knoxville" or whatever, and it all goes back to that movie. And so it shows you how one person's life can have an impact. And so later on, when I give the scholarship monies away, I'll talk a little bit about you and your impact on Pi Kappa Phi and what I expect of you. But over the years, as I got to know Adrian and the Supreme Chapter 8 years ago in Washington, D.C. in 2002, I asked him if he would like to become a brother of Pi Kappa Phi. And this man was initiated in probably in front of about 350 brothers. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce a very good friend and a great American, Adrian Cronauer.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you. When I speak, I usually speak from the heart, but I frequently have some notes so that I don't have a senior moment and forget something I want to say. Here we are, let's see. Unless we receive payment in full by the end... No, that's not it. Here we are. How many of you have seen the movie Good Morning Vietnam? Well, that does wonders for my ego. Probably doesn't hurt my bank balance either. But in the 20-some years since the movie came out, I have learned that there are a lot of things that people want to know about, and I might try and answer a few of those this morning. I've also learned that my 15 minutes of fame, due to the ubiquity of that film on late night cable, my 15 minutes of fame has stretched beyond 20 years. And to give you an example of the kind of thing that happens, a couple years ago I was in Washington at a reception, and they always in Washington give you these little sticky tags with your name on them. My wife calls them nerd tags. And as I was passing a group of people, I overheard one person speaking to another and said, "That's the guy they made that movie about, Good Morning Vietnam." And the other person said, "No, that can't be him. That guy doesn't look a bit like Robin Williams." And the other person said, "Well, of course not. That's Judge Bork." But I think my notoriety or fame or whatever you call it is starting to fade because a couple of weeks ago, Veterans Day, I was up in Washington and for veterans activities, and I had an afternoon that I was free for lunch, so I was going to have lunch with a friend of mine who works in one of the Senate office buildings. So I went into the front door, and the guard was sitting there at the desk with his computer, and I said, "Could you please tell Mr. So-and-so that I'm here?" And he said, "Yes, sir. How do you spell your name?" And I gave it to him, and he typed it into his computer and looked at the screen and said, "Cronauer, Adrian, right?" I said, "Yes." And then he looked at me and said, "The Adrian Cronauer?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "You mean from Dead Poets Society?" It could have been worse. He could have said Mrs. Doubtfire, so. But it's been an interesting several years. We were talking here at the table earlier this afternoon about someone that Tom knew who had flunked out twice and then became very successful. And I'm kind of similar to that because I almost flunked out twice and I almost am successful. But I've learned that the number one question people always ask is, how much of that movie was real? Now, I know we have some veterans in the audience. Anybody who's been in the military? Okay. You guys know that if I'd done half the stuff that Robin Williams did in that movie, I'd still be in Leavenworth instead of Memphis. It's a lot of Hollywood exaggeration and outright imagination. To give you a quick rundown of what was real and what isn't. Let's see. I was a disc jockey in Vietnam. Let me think. Anything else? Oh yes, I did teach English during my off-duty time. No, I was not teaching my class how to swear and use New York street slang. And I wasn't teaching them because I was trying to meet this particularly beautiful Vietnamese girl. At least not one beautiful Vietnamese girl. And let's see what else. I didn't have anybody that I know of try and get me killed. I was not in a Jeep that was blown up by a landmine, and I did not get lost in the jungle avoiding the Viet Cong. And I don't think I had any friends who were Viet Cong, but then in the mid-'60s in Saigon, you did not go up to a Vietnamese acquaintance and say, "Listen, you can tell me, are you really VC, huh? So who knows? People ask, how did the movie come about? I mean, there must have been hundreds of DJs in Vietnam. Why'd they make a movie out of you? And my answer is, well, in 1979, MASH was #1 in the ratings. WKRP in Cincinnati was very popular. And if you put them together, I figured you had Armed Forces Radio. So I did a TV sitcom treatment that I called Good Morning Vietnam, and in 1979 nobody believed you could do a comedy about Vietnam. NBC and CBS wouldn't look at it. ABC looked at it and said, "Oh no, you can't do this." And I said, "Why not?" And they said, "Well, it's war. There's nothing funny about war." I said, "Oh really? Do you ever hear of Hogan's Heroes? Do you ever hear of McHale's Navy? Do you ever hear of MASH?" "Well, that was World War II in Korea." "And your point is?" "Well, this is Vietnam. You can't do a comedy about Vietnam." "Why not?" "Well, it's war. There's nothing funny about war." Did you ever hear of McHale's Navy, Hogan's Heroes, MASH? So a couple of years later, still thinking in terms of television, I redid it as an idea for a movie of the week. And this time a friend's agent got it into Robin's hands, and he looked at it and said, "Oh, disc jockey, chance to do all my comic shtick, let's do it, only let's do it as a real movie. So he and his manager bought an option on it, and every year they'd renew the option. And finally, about 4 years later, they called me up one day and said, "Well, we've decided to go into production, but we're going to have to change everything. We're going to throw out the original and start all over again." So I went out to Hollywood and spent a week there telling them everything I could remember happening in Vietnam, and they'd say things like, "Oh, that's a great incident. We'll have to use that in the movie. Of course, we'll have to change it totally." And it went through 5 different versions. In one version, I was captured by the Viet Cong and kept in a bamboo cage. I was very happy that never happened. And then in another version, I married the Vietnamese girl. My wife says she's glad that never happened. And eventually, I'm sitting in a screening room in Hollywood watching a rough cut and saying to myself, son of a gun, they actually made a movie out of this thing. But one of the things under the heading of what's real, people ask me, what did you think of Robin Williams playing you? Well, he wasn't really playing me. He was playing a character named Adrian Cronauer, who shared a lot of my experiences in Vietnam. But really, he was playing Robin Williams. That's what he always does. And this whole business of the movie was more intended to be a piece of entertainment than an accurate point-by-point biography, which is fine with me because he was nominated for an Academy Award, and you can't do much better than that. But there were some things he did that bothered me a little bit. For example, they had him wearing collar brass on his hat and that sort of thing. And they had one enlisted man saluting another and calling him sir, which is a totally wrong idiom. But the one thing that I did determine is that he did the opening shout all wrong. Because all he did was a rising crescendo of, "Good morning, Vietnam," which is not the way it was done really at all. In reality, you stress the word good for a very practical reason, because if you're a morning man, it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. You are going to oversleep. And when that happens, you come tearing into the station at the very last minute, and you don't have any records pulled, and you don't know where your headphones are, and you haven't put in your contact lenses, and you don't have any tape set up. And as you walk through the door to the studio, you hear the newsman saying, "That's the latest from the Armed Forces Radio Newsroom. Next news in 1 hour." Now you got to do something. So as you pull some records and find your headphones and get everything set up, you turn on the microphone and you say, "Good morning, Vietnam." That's the way we really did it. Thank you. But I've taken a reasonable amount of, I think, justifiable pride in the movie Good Morning Vietnam because of the number of people, veterans, who have told me that it's the first film that began to show Americans in Vietnam as they really were, instead of murderers and rapists and baby killers and dope addicts and psychotics. And I can tell you, I went out into the field dozens of times. I must have interviewed hundreds of Americans in Vietnam. And you know what? I never met a single murderer. I never met a single rapist. I never met a single baby killer. I never met a single dope addict. I never met a single psychotic. What I did find were a lot of good and honorable men, and women too, who might not have been too happy about where they found themselves, but who were determined to do their duty as well and as professionally as they could. And that's the story before Vietnam, Good Morning Vietnam, that was never being told. And because that broke that mold, I think some other stories about Vietnam have been able to come out lately. And I've also, I feel that it's given me a chance to understand what Armed Forces Radio meant to a lot of the people over there, because it's happened several dozen times now. I'll be at a veterans meeting or an activity or a reunion, and a man will come up to me and shake my hand and quietly say, "Thank you for helping me get through Nam." And you know what? I think that's pretty rewarding. And when I go to meet my maker, no matter what happens, I think it's going to say on my tombstone, "Good Morning Vietnam." And that's not a bad legacy. And it's given me a chance to do a lot of things that I felt were important because of that notoriety or fame, whatever you want to call it. For example, I have been, for the past 15 or 16 years, a member of the National Board of the Citizens Flag Alliance, which is a group that's trying to get a constitutional amendment passed that will allow us to protect the American flag from being burned and spit upon and otherwise physically desecrated. I've also am a member of an organization called the Sovereign Military Order of the Temple of Jerusalem. That's a long, complicated title. It's usually called Knights Templars. And they are mostly military people. And each chapter is called a priory, and each priory has its own charities, but on the national level and the international level, they have their charities as well, most of which are aimed toward doing support of the Christian shrines in the Holy Land. And I was talking to Tom Carter about this one time. As Tom said, I got to know him through the Republican Party. I am, and a lot of people are surprised to hear this because they just watch Robin Williams and assume that I'm like him. I'm a lifelong card-carrying Republican, as my father was before me. Yes, and got another one here. I'm not alone. But I have tried to use my notoriety for the good of Republican candidates when I felt they were important, which is how I got involved in trying to help veterans in the Dole campaign, and which is how I came to meet General Carter. And we've become good friends since then. And as I say, I was talking to him about the Templars, and he said, have you ever considered doing other charity work and being involved with the group? Were you in a fraternity in college? And I said, no, I wasn't. So he started to talk to me about Pi Kappa. And he invited me to dinner one evening. He said, there's a fellow I want you to meet, a man by the name of Durwood Owens. And I had lived in the Roanoke area after I got out of the Air Force for about a dozen years, and was very familiar with Roanoke College. In fact, my wife and I were married there in the chapel. So I found out Durwood Owens, who is sort of the fourth founder of Pi Kappa, a delightful person to talk about, but we spent most of that evening talking Roanoke trash, and by the end of the evening, he had his hook in me, and I became a Pi Kappa. And I am delighted that I am a Pi Kappa, because I have found wherever I go, there are Pi Kappas around. And just last night, I found out that the chief judge in the federal courts in the Roanoke area in southwestern Virginia is Jim Turk, who's a Pi Kappa. And there are, well, Bill Kinney told me that last night when I met him. I'm meeting all these great people. About 4 or 5 weeks ago, my wife broke her kneecap, and they had to do some surgery to put it together with screws and wire and things. And while I was at the hospital, and she was in surgery, I went to the hospital cafeteria, and that morning I happened to have my Pi Kappa shirt on. So I was walking through the cafeteria, and a young man tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Are you a Pi Kappa?" And I said, "Yes." And it turned out he was a Roanoke College graduate, and he was now at the hospital in a graduate program to train physician's assistants. And I see there's lots of lawyers around here too, even one criminal lawyer, which they tell me is a redundancy, but but I am delighted all of the people that I have met and all of the activities that I have seen Pi Kappa's doing. And so my feeling is that it's been my, not just pleasure, but my honor to be a Pi Kappa. And from my perspective, I want to thank you for letting me join you. I want to thank you for all you do for your schools and your communities. God bless you. God bless Pi Kappa, and God bless America. And to my fellow veterans, who are some of you here, thank you for all you did, and welcome home.